Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is called Empowering Your Students to Successfully Complete Their Research Project, presented by Charlotte Brookfield and Jamie Lewis. My name is Fawzia Eastwood and I'm a marketing manager at Sage for the Research Methods books portfolio. I'm a cisgender woman of South Asian background. I have long, dark brown hair, brown eyes and olive skin, and I'm wearing a red and black dress and a black cardigan. My pronouns are she/her. I would like to share some general webinar housekeeping information before we begin the session. We're recording the webinar. However, we've switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presenters and the hosts. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without background noise. Also, please do note that the chat box won't be available during this webinar. If you have any questions for our presenters, please write them in the question and answer box. My colleague Amber Howard will be monitoring and co-hosting the question and answer session following the presentation. The presenters will reply to as many of your questions as possible during the session, and then we'll try to follow up with any that we didn't get around to answering today. Please do take advantage of our presenters' expertise and focus any questions you may have around the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and we'll upload the recorded video on Sage's YouTube channel over the next few days. We'll also share it via email and on our social media channels. Sage is on X and also on Blue Sky, so do follow us there if you aren't already. It's at sagepub.com. We have made closed captions available during this webinar, so do switch those on if they're helpful for you. Today's webinar is hosted by Sage. Sage is a global academic publisher of books, journals, and library resources with a growing range of technologies to enable discovery, access, and engagement. Our mission is building bridges to knowledge, supporting the development of ideas through the research process to scholarship that is certified, taught, and applied across all fields of social science. With 60 years of publishing experience, our robust list of publications and digital resources has grown with the social sciences and continues to hold qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research to rigorous standards. Sage content is here to help you at every step of your research journey, with textbooks laying out the fundamentals of the research process, journals highlighting the latest innovations, the Sage Research Methods platform that combines a library of content with interactive tools to guide research at all levels, and the online community method space. We're delighted to introduce today's webinar, which is on the theme of research projects and the ways to support your students as they do them, presented by Sage authors Charlotte Brookfield and Jamie Lewis. Their new textbook is called Completing Your Research Project, which published earlier this year, and it will be referenced during this webinar. And on the next slide, you can find out more about the book at our website, www.sagepub.co.uk, or if you scan the QR code. Attendees of today's webinar can get 25% discount using the code SAGE-AUTH25, or if you're a lecturer, you can request an electronic inspection copy. And so I'm delighted now to welcome and introduce today's presenters. Charlotte Brookfield is a reader at Cardiff University School of Social Sciences. Charlotte is based in the Cardiff Q-Step Centre of Excellence in Quantitative Methods Teaching and Learning. Charlotte's research interests include exploring the extent to which British sociology engages with quantitative approaches and the possible factors that may contribute towards sociology students' resistance to study and use quantitative techniques. Charlotte teaches on a range of research methods and substantive modules at both undergraduate and postgraduate level. Specifically, she convenes a real-world research placement module where students are afforded the opportunity to put into practice the quantitative skills they have acquired in lectures in a local work organisation. Organisations involved in this module include the Welsh Government, the Welsh Blood Service, and the Welsh Wheelchair Basketball Association. Jamie Lewis is a reader in sociology at Cardiff University School of Social Sciences. His research is mainly situated in the sociology of science and technology studies, the STS, but also extends to the public understanding of science, or PUS, and medical sociology. He is one of the authors of Psychiatric Genetics, From Hereditary Madness to Big Biology, and is writing a book examining the development and stabilization of Bigfooting, the practice of gathering evidence of Bigfoot. His areas of research interests include developments in qualitative research, the boundaries between science, pseudoscience, and non-science, the sociology of biomedical knowledge, with particular emphasis on the social implications of new genetic and stem cell technologies, issues of culture, interdisciplinarity, and collaboration in big science, public engagement and public understanding of risk, aspects of practical accomplishment and modelling in the laboratory science, activism and civic repair. He is also an editor of the journal Qualitative Research. Charlotte and Jamie, a huge welcome and over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. So hello everyone, I'm Charlotte and I will introduce myself a little bit further in one moment and also give you a little bit more detail about what we plan to discuss during this webinar and how Jamie and I came to write this book. But before I do that, I want to pass over to Jamie to introduce himself properly and say hello to everyone.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks so much for attending this webinar. Yeah, my name's Jamie, as Charlotte and Fawzia have already mentioned, and also, as they've already mentioned as well, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm a sociologist, probably define myself as a kind of sociologist of science, but I've got a kind of qualitative background, mostly ethnographic methods and interview-based methods, but also I dabble or have dabbled in kind of document research and focus group research as well.
Thank you, Jamie. So yeah, I'm Charlotte. I work alongside Jamie at Cardiff University's School of Social Sciences, and I'm a quantitative researcher, predominantly doing survey research, as well as some secondary data analysis. And Jamie and I have worked very closely over the last few years, developing and delivering an undergraduate dissertation module. And what I want to say from the outset is we're going to use the word dissertation probably quite a lot. What we mean there is an independent piece of research or a research project that a student may complete, where you appreciate that different terms are used in different countries, but we call it a dissertation. So please bear with us if we slip into that terminology. So Jamie and I have been co-convening this large undergraduate dissertation module for a number of years now. We've got a range of students studying that dissertation module from degree programmes including education, criminology, sociology, and even some external joint honours, so students studying things like politics alongside sociology, for example. The module's been very popular. We typically have about 150 students on that module every year. It's a 40-credit module running across the 2 semesters. And as well as that experience, we've actually worked very hard to develop a postgraduate dissertation module for the school. So students studying at postgraduate level always did a dissertation, but there wasn't the lectures and support and structure surrounding that. So Jamie and I worked towards putting that in place in recent years. And obviously on top of that, we've got extensive experience supervising our own undergraduate and postgraduate research students covering a range of different projects. And we'll probably make reference to some of those research projects as we go through the webinar this afternoon. So Jamie and I really decided that we wanted to write this book because we both have expertise in quant and qual methods, and we felt there wasn't a one-shop go-to book that really had detail on both quant and qual out there and the other stages of the research process to go alongside it. So for example, how to write an introduction or how to do a literature review alongside that in-depth methods knowledge that students need when completing an independent research project. But also we felt that our students, when they come along to the lectures and some of the drop-ins and workshops that we run, as well as the supervisory meetings, often seem really full of enthusiasm for their research project. But what we noted is that enthusiasm or that confidence about their research project often wanes in between those periods of contact. So we really wanted to make a resource for students that would help them stay really engrossed and really enthusiastic about their research project throughout. So we're going to make reference in this webinar to some of the resources that are available in both the book and the online resources, which we hope help students with that continuity throughout their research journey. Just to add as well, the webinar this afternoon is based off the blog post that some of you may or may not have had chance to read. So we're really helping you here think about how you can empower your students to successfully complete their research project. We have had a few questions come through in advance, so we may cover some of those during the webinar itself, but if not, as Fawzia said, very happy to take questions at the end.
Just to add 2 points, I think the book is very much directed at undergraduate students doing the social sciences. And we very much have a kind of broad definition of the social sciences, as Charlotte's already alluded to. You know, some of the people on our course are doing politics and sociology, or journalism and sociology, but there's also human and social sciences, which is essentially social psychology, criminology, social policy, and a few other disciplines. That said, we do think the book would be useful to certain postgraduate students, particularly postgraduate students who are doing a postgraduate degree without a background in social science, so that maybe they've moved from one discipline to another. I supervise quite a few PhD students whose background are in natural sciences, for example, because as already mentioned, I am a sociologist of science, and the way in which the natural sciences put together a research project or a dissertation can be quite different to the social sciences, and they struggle with that transition, and it takes a while to talk them through that. So I have shared this book with a few PhD students, and they've also found that useful. Just a final point, and I think it will bleed into the next slide as well, is that Charlotte's alluded to the fact that we have expertise in Charlotte in quantitative and myself in qualitative. So what the book tries to do is not only recognize that they are two slightly different ways of doing a social science research project, but also potentially slightly different ways in presenting the final product, the research report, the dissertation, the capstone. And we recognize that in the book and discuss that, and discuss what is perhaps more typical in quantitative research and what is more typical in qualitative research. So what we try to do in the book is take a student, and the book is directed at students. However, we've tried to turn this webinar into a kind of discussion for lecturers and conveners and facilitators. And there are resources, online resources associated with the book. There are for teachers and lecturers. But what we try to do in the book is take a student on a journey, and on a journey from kind of their nascent idea that turns into a research idea all the way through to submission. And as Charlotte's already alluded to, we see the book as a kind of a guide, a kind of an accompanying guide to go alongside lectures, seminars, supervision, not as a replacement for them, of course, and as a kind of comfort blanket, I suppose, to fill in the gaps when students don't have those lectures or don't have those seminars. So we take the student on a journey from maybe not having much of an idea to formalizing that idea, through to writing, getting ethical application, through to collecting data, analyzing data, writing it up, and actually submitting it. On the right-hand side, hopefully you can see the chapters in the book. And in many ways, the way in which we've ordered the book is an attempt to kind of replicate or reflect the order in which you actually do a research project. And that order that you do a social science research project is sometimes, and quite often, different to how it is written up and presented. So, for example, you might be able to see that it's not until chapter 8 do we discuss introducing, writing an introduction chapter. Why? Well, we would always tell our students to start with a literature review, and not to start with an introduction. An introduction is one of the last chapters you write, because how can you introduce something that you don't know where it's going yet? Also, you will see that the introduction chapter there is it's situated with the conclusion chapter. We see the kind of introduction and conclusion chapters are a bit like sibling chapters. They speak to one another. Yeah, the introduction says what you're going to do. The conclusion tells everyone what you have done. The literature review is a sort of sibling chapter with the kind of substantive discussion or analysis chapters. And then the methods sort of stands alone by itself. So what we try to do, and what we are quite explicit in saying, is that the order in which these chapters are written in the end product is a bit of a lie. You don't start with the introduction. It tends to be one of the last chapters that you write. The other thing that I think is probably worth saying here is that chapters 5 and chapter 6 are quite lengthy chapters. And they're lengthy chapters for a reason. They come in separate parts. So you will see that chapters 5 is about social science data collection, and chapter 6 is about social science data analysis. In there, we split those chapters into qual, quant, and also discuss mixed methods, in the sense of mixed methods here being qualitative and quantitative. And we talk about it in terms of how you go about doing a research project, but also importantly, how a student might look to write that up. On the left-hand side of the screen is a review that's on Amazon. And the reason why we put it up there is that this review really nicely captures what we've intended to do with the book. This review by someone called Emily says, an excellent textbook for completing any type of social science dissertation or research project. So we discuss the various different types of disciplines within social science, but in that regard, it is relatively generic. And it's become my go-to guide, this idea of an accompanying guide to complete my dissertation, covering everything that it needs to do. And it breaks it down into various parts. And that's one of the points we're going to discuss today, about breaking the dissertation, what can be seen to be quite overwhelming for a student, an 8,000 to 10,000, maybe even more project, into tangible, discrete, manageable chunks that they feel that they can do and accomplish, and then move towards submitting their thesis.
Yeah, and just while we're on this slide and Jamie's talking about breaking things down into manageable chunks, those slightly bigger chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6, have really clear scaffolding to help students know where they need to go depending on what type of approach they're taking. So it's really clear to help them there. So throughout the book, we feature real student questions, so questions that we've received over the years from some of our students. Some of the questions where quite often they put before them, this might be a really silly question, and actually they're really frequently asked questions that are really, really important. And one of those is, well, what topic should I do my research project on? Now, we really encourage our students to think about a topic that's going to spark their interest, something that's going to sustain them throughout the research journey. We know that students find doing a dissertation or a capstone project quite consuming. So actually, if they can relate the topic of research to something they're interested in, so a hobby, is actually a really good way of keeping them engaged. Another recommendation we give students, if they don't have a particular hobby that they want to do research on, is to think about what they want to do after university. So what career aspirations do they have? We've mentioned already, we've got a number of education students, for example, who like to do projects perhaps that mean that they can get some classroom experience during the process of collecting their data. So, for example, a few years ago, we had a student that did a project comparing physical education provision in different schools across Wales. And then students find, and we'll touch upon this a little bit later, that if they do something that relates to a future career aspiration, it can really help in terms of applications and interviews. And we'll give another example later on in the webinar. We also suggest that students think back to topics that they may have studied on other modules in the previous years. That can really spark an interest. It can also mean that perhaps that person that taught that particular module can be a really good fit for a supervisor. Think about what's going on. So I think that we can safely say we had a lot of projects a few years ago about COVID and the impacts on learning, online learning. So getting them to think about current affairs, again, can be a real source of inspiration. But alongside this, it actually is getting them to be mindful of any limitations surrounding topic choice. So, for example, Jamie mentioned already that we've got a social psychology degree programme, and those students need to ensure that their dissertation is suitably psychological enough, because it's accredited by the British Psychological Society. So different countries and different degree programmes may have awarding bodies or accreditations that do place some limitations over topic choice. So just making sure that they're mindful of that. I think the other thing to say when they're thinking about topic choice is also to make sure that it's actually an achievable topic. And we use an acronym in the book called SANS. So the S stands for Pacific. So we're saying something that's not too broad, not too big a project, something that's appropriate, so actually something that isn't going to have ethical concerns associated with it, something that is appropriate in terms of level and reach for an undergraduate student, for example. Novel is the N, so something that has an element of originality about it. How does this advance what we already know about the field? D for doable, so something that students can realistically achieve in the time that's set aside for them and with the resources that they have available. And then finally, S for stimulating, so something that's going to keep that interest sustained over the period of their research project.
Yeah, I think one of the things with the social sciences is social science is everywhere. I think I've already alluded to that. I have done laboratory studies, ethnographic studies of the laboratory. So the social science is everywhere. So students get a real wide choice of sites and topics to study. I've supervised students who've done projects on Wicker witches, for example. But I think the important word that came out of Charlotte's talk there is doable. So one, it needs to be ethically sensitive. So it needs to be appropriate and sensitive. And so, for example, there are some restrictions. In the UK, for example, undergraduate students cannot study in prisons. So they can't study inside prisons or with prison guards, for example. However, prisons as a topic can be studied, but not necessarily through interviews or observation, maybe newspaper reports, for example. So it's not just the topic, it's thinking about the topic in relation to how you are studying that topic. I think two other points to make, and Charlotte's already alluded to one of them, is you have an interest. So the S in SANS was specific. It's then narrowing the gaze, making it into a researchable project, one that has research questions that can be answered, but one that can be answered in the time slot that students have. And the other term that we tend to use in the book is the kind of formalizing a curiosity. This idea is something that you're interested in, fascinated by, stimulating, and to formalize that through social science methods. So these are all, we think anyway, good tips for students. There will be times where students will get fed up with their research project. There are certainly times when I get fed up with my research project. So you want to hang on to something, and that hanging on to something hopefully is why they started it to begin with, because they were interested in answering a social science question or questions about a topic that really interests them. So one of the maxims in the book we have is something like get it written first, get it right afterwards, or get it writ, then get it right. I think there's lots of reasons why we say this. One, you can edit something, but you can't edit nothing. And some of the students we see struggling are those students who aren't putting things down on paper, or perhaps more appropriately on their laptops now, and are waiting until the end. Some of those students will tell you that they can write very, very quickly, but they then seem to struggle because time is of an essence then, and stress turns into distress in many ways. So we have this thing of get it written first, get it right afterwards. Other reasons why we say that is, I think we both are advocates that you can get better at writing. There are various different types of writing, of course, and academic writing is a particular style of writing. So not just getting better at writing, but getting better at writing in an academic way, using academic prose, citing properly, expressions. And half the battle, in many ways, is being able to express your thoughts and ideas in a way that is accessible, but grounded, obviously, in research. So you can get better at writing. Editing also can take a long time. So I think it's like pages, I'm just looking, page 247 to 249 of the book, we discuss editing. And I think students never really think about how long editing can take. Those students who do really well set themselves an artificial deadline well before the deadline that their dissertation or equivalent needs to be submitted. So they have time to edit it. During that editing process, you really should only be making things better. You're finessing your language, you're tightening up arguments. So you write much more than 8 to 10,000 words, which when you tell an undergraduate student at the start of the year, 8 to 10,000 words, for nearly all of them, sounds like an enormous amount of words and the biggest single project they've been involved with. But almost to a person, I will have students come up and go, I really struggle to keep it down to 8 to 10,000 words. And actually writing to a word count is a real craft and a real skill. And again, practicing and writing it and sharpening that writing in is an essential skill in doing a research project like this. So Charlotte and myself, and for several years now, give students writing tasks, manageable writing tasks throughout the 2 semesters that we convene the module. So a writing task may even be an abstract. It may be an introduction to a chapter. It may be putting together the research design, a short paragraph or 2, or a section around ethics in the methods chapter, for example, maybe even completing a ethics application. But really, we push students to not bullet point this, but to write as if they were submitting it. So they get into the practice of writing full sentences, full paragraphs, and transitioning well to the next point. I think the other thing about writing, it is a tangible task. And when students have written something and got it down on paper or on the laptop, they tend to feel comforted by that. They can see progress. Whereas reading and thinking and managing and organizing, sometimes it's hard to kind of show what progress you've made. But writing something down feels as if they've made progress towards the end game, which is submitting a thesis.
Yeah, and that links quite well into our next slide here, which is on setting manageable goals and planning rewards. I think it's inevitable that students will compare themselves to one another, where they're at in their research project, who's collected their data, who's had ethical approval, for example, who's written, how many words everybody's written. And actually, we really try and stress throughout the book and in our teaching that each research project is unique. And students will be at different points throughout the 2 semesters. So to help with that, it's really important that they work with their supervisors to set some manageable goals and some timescales there. And in the book, we talk about creating either a Gantt chart or a Kanban board to organise students' tasks according to the time they've got. Jamie mentioned there that 8 to 10,000 words seems like an awful lot for students. They also think at the start of the semester that two semesters to complete a research project seems like a very long time. So we have to then get them to focus on the other things that will be happening during that period. So, for example, if they've got deadlines for other modules, getting them to flag those, any celebrations they might be having, any periods of rest or other responsibilities that they might have, really making sure that they focus on those when they are making their own timescales. We do encourage them to plan rewards as well throughout the research process. So in a way, these chapter checklists, which you can see hopefully on the slide here, are a way to allow students to tick things off when they've done them. There's one of those for each of the chapters in the book. And we hope that sense of being able to tick things off does give students that little boost of confidence and satisfaction that they have achieved something. But beyond that, we say, do things like make sure you have a relaxing evening, make sure you watch your favourite TV series, enjoy a particular meal, and so on and so forth. And actually, we've been really fortunate that the last few years, we've been able to organise events for our students to help, again, recognise the achievement that they have undergone whilst doing a dissertation. So for our module, students actually present for 15 minutes, followed by a 5-minute Q&A session on their research project as part of a conference, which usually takes place towards the beginning of the spring semester. And following that, we like to do some sort of reception to acknowledge the hard work of the students and to allow them to come together in a more relaxed environment. So we'd really encourage, if people do have the budgets available, appreciate that it's not always very easy to negotiate those things, to be able to arrange that for the students, because it really does mean a lot to them to have that time to decompress with others that are going through the same thing?
Yeah, I think particularly when students start a research project, they've got, everything and nothing to do. Yeah, it almost feels quite abstract, the submission of a dissertation project. And what we tried to do in the book and what we tried to do in our lectures is make that abstract feel a bit more concrete by creating these kind of manageable, tangible tasks, and breaking it down so they feel like they're moving towards something. So beyond the kind of Gantt chart and Kanban board, we also suggest to students they might even just put together a good old timetable, a timetable that is reasonable and sensible. So not something that is basically overexerting themselves or overselling what they're going to do, but something that is sensible, that also includes breaks, rests, understands that they have a social life, understand that they have competing modular demands as well. They're not doing this in isolation. They're doing it as part of a course where they've got other modules and assessments and assignments to do. So putting together a timetable that is realistic, that also includes unforeseen circumstances. It's very rare that you have a student go through a year, or depending on how long they're doing this dissertation, without something having cropped up. So, so sort of baking in, I guess, that flexibility and being sensible. So, we tell students, almost create a weekly timetable around the dissertation module and what you can work on it, and discuss that with your supervisors. I think the other thing, just to finally say, is that a lot of students I've spoken to find a dissertation or research project module quite all-consuming. They said sometimes with other modules they can forget the module once an assessment's been submitted, but they're investing part of themselves in this as well. So we also, beyond organized events, Charlotte and I, organize what we call drop-ins, and they're essentially, teaching events or teaching slots where we can talk to individual students about their projects. And we only introduced that actually from when COVID started, this kind of drop-in as an approach, and I think it's been extremely successful. The students seem to particularly value it on kind of modular feedback when we come to the dissertations, just these kind of not obligatory but optional teaching times where people can come and just speak to myself and Charlotte about their individual project and work through particular snags and issues that they have.
Yeah, just on that timetabling thing that Jamie raised there, I think we've spoken to a few students in the past that find it easier to dedicate perhaps a set day to working on their dissertation in the week. So it might be, for example, that on a Friday morning they're going to go to the dissertation lecture, and after that lecture they're then going to meet their supervisor, and then they're going to spend the rest of that day working on their dissertation. Now, for some people that is too rigid and there wouldn't be enough flexibility in them in that timetable for them to have that plan, but for others that works quite well. So it's just, again, talking to students and getting them to be aware of those other commitments they've got to fit alongside their dissertation.
So making the most of supervision. So at Cardiff, students have lectures that are mostly delivered by myself and Charlotte. They have a few workshops as well, and then they also get allocated a supervisor at the start of the project, and they have 10 hours of supervision across those 2 semesters. I think sometimes as lecturers we forget that students are unfamiliar with what supervision means. They're used to lectures, sometimes didactic, formal events. They're used to seminars, smaller events, but still group events. But they sometimes do not understand how supervision works and that kind of supervisory relationship. I think it's pages 64 to 67 in the book. We talk about students becoming active note takers. I would extend that to becoming active learners rather than passive note takers and passive learners. So what you want to have is a student to have the confidence and the legitimization to turn up to supervision with their own questions, to almost direct the supervision themselves, not to be told what to do, but to ask, is this an appropriate way of doing it? What do you think about this? So, the supervisor becomes a sort of mentor rather than a facilitator or a lecturer. But that's kind of alien to a lot of undergraduate students before embarking on this. So I think it's to give those students the confidence and to let them know what supervision is. I have so many students who come to supervision and don't take down any notes or don't write anything. So you want a student to be, not only proactive and directing and being prepared for that supervision, but actually taking something away from it. So getting them into the practice again of writing, whether it's, in this case, note taking. We produce kind of supervisory logs so that a supervisor and a student sign off on what was discussed and what was agreed in that particular supervisory meeting. We get the students to contact the supervisor for the first supervision, again kind of promoting that kind of proactive approach. We try to get the students to kind of record those questions between meetings, to set the next meeting in that meeting, not to leave it. Again, all of this I think is important, and it's important for the next slide that we'll go on to in terms of those skills that sometimes undergraduate students sometimes don't have in terms of directing and managing projects, being proactive, and their communication skills. So the bottom bullet point there, transparent about delays. I think any reasonable lecturer realizes things don't necessarily go as swimmingly as you hope them to be. So you might work with a supervisor to kind of set a trajectory. I think what's important, if things are going off-piste, if delays are happening, and there may be completely valid reasons, unforeseen reasons for those delays, is that students communicate those delays, not leave it to the last minute. I'm certainly encourage my students to keep communication, to keep that channel open with me and tell me, right, how are you progressing? Why are you stuck? What's happened? What do you need to prioritize now? Okay, we can work through another type of schedule. So I think the supervisory meeting and the relationship that a student builds with a supervisor is vitally important to kind of producing a successful research project or dissertation. But sometimes we as lecturers assume they know what to do in those meetings, when sometimes I think we need to help them or give them the confidence to say, look, you can direct these meetings rather than being told what to do.
Yeah, and I think just to build on the point Jamie made there about students taking notes, I think increasingly we're also seeing all students request that they can actually record those meetings. And we'd really encourage, if you do feel comfortable with that, that's a really good way for students then to go back and listen to that meeting afterwards and make notes or check their own notes and really engage and get the most out of that supervisory meeting. We know some of them come, particularly at the beginning, a little bit nervous, as Jamie alluded to, about having that one-to-one conversation with a member of academic staff. So if they can have a recording, it is another way, perhaps when they are in their own space, to go back over that conversation and to come up with any follow-up questions. So the last slide we've got here is about really encouraging your students to record the skills that they develop throughout their research project. So we've discussed throughout this how a research project can be quite a large and daunting task for students, also a very rewarding one. And one of the ways in which we hope that students feel the reward of doing a research project is actually to have a moment to sort of take a step back and reflect on some of the skills that they've developed throughout the research journey. So when we're sort of talking about the module and promoting the module, we do allude to the fact that students will gain these employability skills, but I think we need to do a lot of work whilst they're studying the module to remind them and to actually get them to record those skills that they're developing. So this year, what we actually introduced to our dissertation module, and what we'd encourage others to do if they've got the capacity, is we actually invited the Cardiff University Careers Service to come to a lecture to talk to our students about how to make the most of their dissertation. So how to explain and sell themselves in a CV, a cover letter, or in an interview, and to talk about their research and the skills that they gained. And that was a really valuable addition to the lecture series, and students really appreciated knowing how to communicate what they had done to potential employers. And that also links back to that very first slide on topic choice. So again, making students think about a topic that when they write about it, it's going to really stand out to an employer. We also had a student a couple of years ago that spoke to us about her, she did a dissertation or a research project on transport technology. And she later went and did that presentation for the BMW grad scheme, was successful in getting onto that scheme. And she actually wrote to Jamie and myself and said that she was really grateful for the opportunity to present at the dissertation conference about her research, because it had allowed her to think about how to effectively communicate what she had done to the interview panel.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth us expanding a little bit on that. So the module that we run, students have to submit an 8,000 to 10,000 word dissertation, and that's worth 80% of their overall mark. But their other assessment is a 15-minute presentation, and we run a undergraduate social science dissertation conference where students present for 15 minutes and then have 5 minutes Q&A with staff members. And it was that 15-minute presentation that she did in the dissertation conference that she used as a presentation in her interview and got her that job. So, I mean, something as simple as titles, when it comes to dissertation titles, sometimes students will stress over that. And on the one hand, I don't want them to, clearly not. But on another, I do sometimes tell them that look, your dissertation title might end up in your CV. So think, maybe think strategically in terms of a title that works with what you want to do in the future. Charlotte and I have written a blog about these skills developed on the dissertation module, and we can share that at a later date if you want. I think, I always think, why do we get students to do a research project? Most social science programs will have a dissertation or similar project, and in many cases it is the kind of culmination of their work. It's combining what they've learnt in theoretical conceptual modules with what topics, substantive modules, with kind of methodological skills. Yeah. And in one aspect, it becomes a training module. Maybe if they want to go on to go postgraduate and do research. But a lot of students won't move on to postgraduate and do research. So there's other skills that are developed that sometimes we don't foreground as much as perhaps we should. And there's those skills, of course, that employers are looking for. Some of them are up on screen: time management, communication skills. So students who can arrange their own interviews, then actually conduct and undertake an interview, sometimes with people who are relatively senior. Those are those skills that they are sometimes not recognizing themselves, and we work with them to kind of put that down on paper and say, these are important skills: team working, project management, presentation skills, writing skills. Those are all the skills that the students are learning and developing alongside their kind of social science knowledge when putting together a research project of 8,000 to 10,000, maybe even more words.
So I think we're going to open it up to questions now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I believe Amber is going to chair this part of the session for us. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both. That was absolutely great. I'll just share that I'm Amber. I'm a marketing executive at Sage, and my pronouns are she, her. For accessibility purposes, I'll share that I'm a cisgender white woman with short brown hair, and I'm wearing grey headphones, pink glasses, and a white t-shirt. So I won't take up any more time because we've got some great questions coming through. I'll just go on to one that we've had come through live in relation to what you've said, which was, how did you decide on the 10 hours of supervision? Is that standard in your university or just in your department?
It's a good question. It's not standard across the university as far as I understand. So we have a workload model in our school. So each supervisor is given 15 points for supervision. So 15 points basically is equivalent of 15 hours. So Charlotte and I made a decision of those 15 hours, 10 hours are supervision, 5 in each semester. It's run across 2 semesters. The other 5 hours are then made up of helping students get through ethics, giving feedback, constructive feedback, and a few other jobs that are involved in supervision. I think we are on the more generous side, having spoken with and my knowledge of some other institutions, but I do think students really value that. I really do think, students value the relationship that they have with the supervisor. They become a potential referee as well, someone they know, and it's a different type of relationship to lecturer student. But our dissertation is 2 semesters. I know some are 1 semester, so that might determine how, the number of hours you provide. Most of the supervision meetings are 1-to-1, but we do allow for group supervision as well. And actually, what I tend to do is have mostly 1-to-1 supervision, but on occasions have group supervision. And as long as all the students are comfortable. So one example where I do group supervision is I will do a practice run with them for their presentations, and then they can see someone else, their peers as well, and pick up some points from that. So sometimes I think having group supervision can be helpful alongside the 1-to-1.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I guess the only sort of other guidance we give in terms of supervision is that we suggest that supervisors only read students' work once in the interest of parity. So that's the other restriction there. But otherwise, yeah, fairly flexible depending on what the supervisor, and also importantly, what the student finds most comfortable and works best for them.
We do have in the book a set of tasks that supervisors or lecturers could use for running supervisory events. So we were mindful of that as well. So if you're looking for certain activities or tasks to do in supervision, there are some suggested in the book.
Brilliant. Thank you both. That's amazing. I'm seeing a couple of questions come through, and I know we had some submitted beforehand on a similar topic, and I don't think it will shock anyone that that topic is generative AI. So without taking up too much of the session, it's difficult not to ask questions about that in the current day. So we've had a question of how would you convince students not to rely on AI for their writing, and questions about how it can be used. So just sort of a general AI in relation to the research project question.
Shall I start, Charlotte?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, yeah, I was waiting for this one. So these are my terms, no one else's. I think we have AI optimists and AI pessimists. I'm trying to work out where I am on that spectrum. Maybe I'm being unfair. I reckon Charlotte's more optimistic than me, maybe, but I'm neither left or right in that regard. I think we've got to be sensible and reasonable and understanding that AI is going to be part of our lives. But how it affects different disciplines is a serious issue. And the social sciences, if we want to call those a kind of an umbrella discipline, or literary disciplines where writing's involved, it's a significant. It's potentially a significant threat as well as a potential opportunity. We do have a box about AI in the book. We don't go too much into it. And I think by memory, what we say is that AI is still stabilizing and how it's to be used. I do think universities have buried their heads in the sand for far too long. I think it would be naive of us to think that students aren't using AI. And if they aren't using AI, they're looking at their friends using AI and thinking, why can't I use AI? What we do say in the book is that sometimes students should trust themselves a lot more and trust their supervisors and lecturers. So when it comes to social science modules, we curate reference lists for them. That is doing much more work than ChatGPT, that might come up with something a bit more generic in that regard. I guess we all use, in some sense, some sort of grammar thing these days. I mean, Word will change your words. So, but there are degrees, and I still remember the concerns people had with Wikipedia. And I think what we need to do is speak to our students directly about AI, what it is, how it works, what it can do, and importantly, what it can't do. I do see a potential future where AI might help with curating literature reviews. I'm not necessarily advocating that at all, but I think we need to have honest discussions with our students, and to work with them, perhaps to work with generative AI in a way that we think is appropriate and reasonable.
Yeah, I think as Jamie said there, the genie is out the bottle. We know our students are using it, so it's how they use it and giving them the tools to use it appropriately. Um, I think I think Jamie and I probably both share concerns that whilst AI can be really good, but really well placed to help students improve the clarity and the flow of their writing, for example, that will that mean that universities withdraw funding, for example, for students that aren't English first language and usually have support sessions? And we definitely don't want to see that. So perhaps that's another way of framing it to students, is that is it going to take away from this valuable resource that others need? Having said that, as was alluded to in the formal introduction, I run a placement module, and actually the number of students that were out on placement where there was a provider in one of these organisations that said to the student when they didn't know how to do something in SPSS, why have you not put it into ChatGPT? I do feel that we're going to get students that are entering a workforce where it's expected that that would be the first thing they do before asking for help. So it's a very tricky one.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that I think that's a good example as well. There's differences, I think, between asking ChatGPT to kind of create code or helping with a statistical test to writing. So I think we've got to also recognize that, you know, AI can do different things, and there are certain jobs that maybe we see, maybe we will differ, I don't know, but maybe we would agree is more reasonable than others. Of course, we don't want students having something written for them by AI. And, you know, we are hearing stories of students, you know, manufacturing data through AI, you know. So there needs to be a discussion. We can't keep burying our heads in the sand. There needs to be a discussion with our students.
That's great. Thank you both. I know it's no easy question to tackle, but I feel like it's difficult not to sort of bring it into these sort of discussions. We've had another question come through live. Jacob has said, my university asks L6 students to complete a 6,000 word dissertation. This is shorter than other UK institutions. How do I best support students in developing research ideas which interest them, but also consider the scale of their projects to ensure they present a realistic 6,000 word project, having difficulty with students proposing research on too large a scale?
Yeah, so just to kind of summarize and check I got that, Amber, 6,000 word research project and how to make sure that the scope of it is not too big.
Yes, finding the sort of middle ground of what's best, but still interesting.
Yeah, so thank you for confirming, but I think one of the activities that we get students to do quite early doors is to think about who do they want to research and to try and be as detailed as possible, what they want to find out from those people, and again, being as detailed as possible, why they want to find that out, what's the rationale, how they're going to do it, and when they're going to do it. And again, that those questions also start getting them to think about ethical sensitivities. So, for example, they're not going to be going and collecting their data at 11 o'clock at night on a street corner, because that would not necessarily be the safest environment for them to be in. So I think if you can encourage them to answer those questions in as much detail as possible, that does help with bringing that scope in a little bit further. I think regardless of the word count, students do tend to think a little bit too big, and it is a challenge that we face, even at 8,000 to 10,000 words, bringing them back in a little bit. Most of them put forward something initially that perhaps would take sort of 3 to 5 years to actually complete.
Yeah, I think this is where the writing tasks might be important, because actually writing to a lower word count. So I should say that ours is 8,000 to 10,000 words, and that does not include references and does not include any of the front matter. Writing to 6,000 words can be a lot more difficult than writing to 10,000 words. So every word counts in many ways. So being very, very direct, not wasting words, thinking about what tense you're using. So rather than the future tense of I will consider, I consider, you've saved yourself one word. So I think it's not just about the scope, because Charlotte's absolutely right. Every student, 90% of students want to do something that is not doable to begin with. You need to work with them. So it's the scope, but also getting them to write in a kind of punchy manner, I think is important. But if you have any sway, I wonder whether you could try to push your institution to have a bit of a range. One of the reasons why we have a range is to reflect that qualitative researchers will be using a lot more words in their data extracts compared to quantitative. So that's why we have the range of 8 to 10,000.
I think just to add another point that I thought of there is we find that students sometimes find it quite helpful to look at dissertations or research projects completed by previous cohorts of students, because that then does give them an indication of what is achievable within the time frame. So we generally select a small sample of really good dissertations from a cohort and get those students permission to then share them on. And I think that can be quite helpful early doors for a student to read a dissertation to get a sense of what they're expected to do and what is actually achievable.
Brilliant. Thank you both. It's definitely true that every word matters, and that was so great advice. I think we've got time for one more question. I'll take one more live, and if there's any that we haven't been able to get to or any that were sent in advance, then we'll definitely aim to follow up on those if they haven't been covered. But somebody wrote, you mentioned that you encourage students to begin their research projects with the literature review. I'm just wondering, if they've not clearly defined their research problem and formulated their research questions and objectives, how can they know what sort of literature to review?
I guess it's a good question, but I guess that's why we encourage them to put together their literature review, because the literature review should be helping them formulate a research question. A lot of the students will ask me, how do you write a literature review? And I tend to say it's the chapter that's closest to an essay. But whereas with an essay, you end up answering a question, in a literature review, you should be finishing with your research questions. So in many ways, you're distilling down towards those research questions. So those research questions should, in some ways, be talking to the literature that you're locating your work in. So I guess before you start writing a literature review, you've got to have a kind of a broad idea of your topic. But in terms of your particular research project and the research questions, I think that should come out of a distillation of your literature review, and it should help you kind of create those research questions. I will accept, though, and I do understand how the two kind of work hand in hand. But yeah, basically, that's how we do it. We get them to think through their literature review, start to get writing into the practice of writing. That should be helping them either kind of notice any of the gaps in the literature, or being able to build on certain questions that have already been asked to help them shape their research questions.
Yeah, we always say to students that a literature review is an iterative chapter, and it's one that they will probably all rewrite quite a few times. And I suppose that's where some of the work that is involved in writing a chapter is somewhat hidden. Some of those writing tasks that we would suggest a student does is, for example, doing a reading and then writing a summary of that reading, the strengths, the limitations, how they could do something different. So that could be a writing task. And then once they have done all of their readings, it's then selecting the literature that then goes into that literature review, and so that they can then formalize those research questions.
Yeah, it's probably best to say drafting their literature review, because they will always return to their literature review.
Yeah.
The literature review works hand in hand with the substantive chapters, and until you've actually got your data, you don't necessarily are able to return to the literature review. So once you got your data, you will always have to return to the literature review and make sure that it's fitting in line with what you've found.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Those are some great answers. I'll just hand over back to Fawzia now for a quick conclusion to this webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Amber, for curating the question and answer section. And thank you very much, Charlotte, to Jamie for the very illuminating and very engaging presentation and discussion. And, you know, for kind of being so candid with all of your replies during the question and answer section. It was really, really interesting. Just finishing up now, thank you very much to everyone for attending. And if you did ask a question, as mentioned by Amber, if we didn't get around to answering it today, we'll try to follow up later. So do, you know, visit our webpage to find out more about Charlotte and Jamie's book, Completing Your Research Project. You can buy a copy of that book with 25% discount using the code SAGE, AUTH25. And also request an inspection copy from our webpage if you are a lecturer. As mentioned, we recorded the webinar. We'll be sending you an email with the recording link over the coming weeks, so you can watch it again or share it with any colleagues who may be interested and that may have missed it. So again, thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Jamie, for your time today, for the very insightful presentation. Thank you also to Amber for the question and answer session and all the technical support that you provided. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Goodbye.